What happens when someone fires you using power they don't legally have? My name is Isabella Wren. I'm 43 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years inside the company my father built from a rented warehouse and a borrowed desk. I've negotiated supplier crises, absorbed market shocks, and rebuilt departments no one else wanted to touch. I didn't inherit my role. I earned it line by line, quarter by quarter. The quarterly strategy meeting was supposed to be routine. Forecast revisions, acquisition alignment, margin adjustments. Instead, it turned into theater. Vanessa Cross, CEO, Daniel Cross's wife, and the company's self-appointed executive culture advisor rose from her seat before I had finished presenting the operational variance report. "That's enough," she said sharply. "We don't need incompetent people like you steering critical strategy." The room went still. I closed my laptop gently. "Excuse me," Vanessa didn't blink. "The board has approved a restructuring. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately." Across the table, Daniel sat motionless. No objection, no correction, just a slow fold of his hands, as if silence could pass for endorsement. "The board approved this," I asked calmly. "That's what I said," Vanessa replied, sliding a document across the table. A termination memo, company letterhead, executive authority signature block. Daniel's name was printed neatly at the bottom. No board resolution number, no compliance notation, no HR representative in the room, just borrowed authority wrapped in confidence. I stood, no raised voice, no trembling hands. 20 years in corporate rooms had taught me one thing. Composure unsettles more than anger. "Understood," I said, gathering my folder. "Thank you for the clarity." Vanessa looked almost disappointed. She'd expected outrage. Maybe tears, maybe a scene. Instead, I walked out of that boardroom without another word, and Daniel never called after me. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. The first time I learned about the trust, I was 40 years old, not 25, not fresh out of graduate school, not naive, 40. My father had structured it that way deliberately. He believed power given too early distorted judgment. So he built something layered, patient, and invisible. 90% of the company's voting shares were placed into an irrevocable holding trust the year before he passed. Not directly under my name, not publicly. They sat behind a proxy voting structure, dormant, legally sound, but inactive, until I chose to file an activation notice. Until then, the board assumed ownership was dispersed across estate vehicles and legacy allocations. Technically, they weren't wrong. They just didn't know who controlled the proxy. When I turned 40, the trustee handed me a sealed binder. "You have full voting authority," she said, "including the right to call a special shareholder meeting and remove executive leadership without requiring a second vote." There was also a clause my father insisted on adding: an emergency governance override if executive leadership engaged in material misrepresentation, fiduciary breach, or governance abuse. The controlling shareholder could intervene immediately. No waiting for consensus, no begging for alignment. For 3 years. I did nothing with it. Not because I didn't see the shifts happening. I saw Vanessa's increasing presence in operational reviews. I saw Daniel defer when he shouldn't. I saw HR complaints quietly redirected. I saw margin compression disguised as strategic investment. But I wanted to lead without the shadow of inheritance. I wanted to earn influence, not exercise ownership. Power's loud when used too early. My father knew that. So did I. The trust wasn't a weapon. It was structure. And structure doesn't react to ego. It waits for breach. When Vanessa slid that termination memo across the table and invoked board approval that never happened, something subtle shifted, not emotionally, legally. The clause my father wrote wasn't triggered by insult. It was triggered by misuse of authority. And now the question wasn't whether I owned 90%. It was whether the company's leadership had just given me a reason to use it. When does patience become negligence? The first time I learned about the trust, I was 40 years old, not 25, not fresh out of graduate school, not naive, 40. My father had structured it that way deliberately. He believed power given too early distorted judgment. So he built something layered, patient, and invisible. 90% of the company's voting shares were placed into an irrevocable holding trust the year before he passed. Not directly under my name, not publicly. They sat behind a proxy voting structure, dormant, legally sound, but inactive until I chose to file an activation notice. Until then, the board assumed ownership was dispersed across estate vehicles and legacy allocations. Technically, that they weren't wrong. They just didn't know who controlled the proxy. When I turned 40, the trustee handed me a sealed binder. "You have full voting authority," she said, "including the right to call a special shareholder meeting and remove executive leadership without requiring a second vote." There was also a clause my father insisted on adding: an emergency governance override. If executive leadership engaged in material misrepresentation, fiduciary breach, or governance abuse, the controlling shareholder could intervene immediately. No waiting for consensus, no begging for alignment. For 3 years, I did nothing with it. Not because I didn't see the shifts happening. I saw Vanessa's increasing presence in operational reviews. I saw Daniel defer when he shouldn't. I saw HR complaints quietly redirected. I saw margin compression disguised as strategic investment. But I wanted to lead without the shadow of inheritance. I wanted to earn influence, not exercise ownership. Power is loud when used too early. My father knew that. So did I. The trust wasn't a weapon. It was structure. And structure doesn't react to ego. It waits for breach. When Vanessa slid that termination memo across the table and invoked board approval that never happened, something subtle shifted. Not emotionally, legally. The clause my father wrote wasn't triggered by insult. It was triggered by misuse of authority. And now the question wasn't whether I owned 90%. It was whether the company's leadership had just given me a reason to use it. When does patience become negligence? I didn't go home and rage. I went home and opened a folder. 20 years in operations teaches you something most executives never learn: emotion fades. But documentation survives. The termination memo Vanessa slid across the table sat neatly on my kitchen counter that evening. Company letterhead. Executive authority signature block. Daniel's printed name. No board resolution reference, no compliance routing code, no HR co-signature. But the line that mattered most was a single sentence: pursuant to board-approved restructuring. That wasn't careless wording. That was representation. And representation, when false, becomes liability. I logged into my archived executive email and searched for any board vote, motion, or restructuring notice tied to my role. Nothing. No draft minutes, no governance review, no compensation committee adjustment. Then I found the company-wide email Vanessa sent 20 minutes after I left the building. Following today's board-backed leadership realignment, board-backed. I forwarded both documents to my private counsel with one line: "Please confirm governance exposure." Within an hour, he called. "If the board did not authorize this," he said carefully, "and executive authority was represented as such." "That's material misstatement." "Fiduciary?" I asked. "Potentially." I didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge, then it was about sequence. I requested a copy of the last 3 board meeting summaries through standard shareholder access channels quietly, without escalation. If I was going to move, I would move on record. By midnight, I'd assembled a clean timeline. Public termination under implied board authority. Written communication repeating false governance backing. No documented vote. No compliance review receipt. Level 1, clear, contained, verifiable. I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for breach. Because once governance integrity fractures, it doesn't repair itself. It either gets ignored or it gets corrected. And correction requires structure. How many leaders assume no one is reading the fine print? The next morning, I met with 2 people who understood power better than most executives ever would: the corporate attorney who had drafted my father's trust, and the trustee who had managed it quietly for years. We didn't speak about emotion. We spoke about exposure. I laid the documents across the conference table. Termination memo, internal email, board summaries. The attorney adjusted his glasses and read slowly. "If the board did not authorize restructuring," he said, "and executive leadership represented that they did. That's governance misrepresentation." "Does spousal involvement complicate it?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "If a non-elected individual exercised executive authority or influenced operational termination decisions, it raises fiduciary concerns." The trustee slid another folder toward me. I've been tracking performance trends, she said calmly. Executive bonuses increased 19% last year. Revenue growth was flat. Employee turnover rose 12%. And there are 3 unresolved discrimination complaints under HR review. I absorbed the numbers without reacting. None of this alone was catastrophic. Together, it formed a pattern. Executive overreach, weak oversight, inflated projections, suppressed internal risk signals. The attorney leaned back. If you activate the emergency governance override, the board will be legally obligated to respond. But understand this once you file. There's no quiet resolution. It becomes public within governance channels. Could Daniel challenge the trust, I asked? Unlikely. The proxy structure is airtight. But he could attempt to delay, to frame this as personal retaliation. Retaliation. The word lingered. For 3 years, I had chosen patience over ownership. I wanted leadership to evolve without intervention. Now the fault line was visible. Not because Vanessa insulted me, but because she claimed authority that did not exist. Governance fails slowly until someone forces it to answer. The trustee closed the folder. The question isn't whether you can act, she said. It's whether you're ready for what acting costs. If integrity cracks at the top, who pays for the silence beneath it? Vanessa could have stopped at humiliation. She didn't. At 9:12 a.m. the following Monday, a company-wide email went out under the executive distribution list. Subject: Leadership Realignment. Effective immediately. Isabella Wren has been removed from her position pursuant to board-approved restructuring. This decision reflects our commitment to stronger executive vision and operational modernization. Board approved. The phrase was deliberate. Within minutes, access permissions were revoked, my corporate email deactivated, my name removed from the executive directory, the internal org chart updated to reflect interim oversight under CEO supervision. Daniel's digital signature appeared at the bottom of the memo. Not a counter signature, a confirmation. By 9:40 a.m., 2 department heads texted me screenshots and did this actually go through the board? It hadn't. At 10:05 a.m., my private counsel called. This is escalation, he said quietly. The representation is now formal. They've repeated the claim in writing, under executive authority, material governance misrepresentation, not emotion, not insult, representation of authority that did not exist. That was the trigger. At 10:22 a.m., I opened the activation binder. The emergency governance override clause required only 3 steps. File controlling shareholder activation notice, submit request for special shareholder meeting, provide documented evidence of material breach. I completed the notice in 22 minutes. At 10:51 a.m., the trustee countersigned electronically. At 11:03 a.m., a formal notification was delivered to all board members, corporate legal counsel, executive governance office. Subject line notice of activation, controlling shareholder authority, 90%. The message was brief. As controlling shareholder, I am exercising my right to convene an emergency meeting to review executive governance and leadership conduct. Supporting documentation attached. There was no dramatic language, no accusation, just structure. At 11:18 a.m., I received confirmation of receipt from the board counsel. At 11:26 a.m., Daniel called. I let it ring once before answering. What is this? He demanded. It's governance, I replied evenly. Silence followed. The trust had been dormant for 3 years. Now it was active. Borrowed authority had collided with ownership. And once activated, structure does not retreat. What happens when someone assumes power is performance and learns its accountability instead? Daniel didn't wait for the emergency meeting. He called the board first. By the time I arrived at corporate counsel's office for preliminary coordination, a counter-narrative was already circulating. Controlling shareholder interference, Daniel had framed it. Emotional retaliation disguised as governance. Vanessa, I was told, had contacted an outside communications firm within hours of the activation notice. A draft press statement was being prepared in case the board session leaked. Founder's daughter attempts power grab? Predictable, but Daniel didn't stop at messaging. At 2:14 p.m., my attorney forwarded me a formal letter from his legal team. They argued that my activation constituted improper fiduciary disruption and threatened to pursue injunctive relief if the shareholder meeting proceeded without further review. He was trying to stall. If he could delay the vote, he could stabilize perception. If he stabilized perception, He could isolate me. If he isolated me, he could frame this as inheritance overreach. There was also something else. The $800 million acquisition we had been negotiating for 6 months was now officially on hold. The target company's counsel requested clarification regarding executive stability before proceeding. Markets do not like uncertainty. By late afternoon, trading volume had spiked. The stock closed down 3.1% on unusual activity. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. That was Daniel's leverage. "Are you prepared for volatility?" my attorney asked quietly. "He's betting you'll hesitate once the market reacts." I thought of Marcus, my closest ally in operations, who had texted earlier. "Is this necessary? People are nervous." Yes, it was necessary, but necessary doesn't mean painless. At 6:03 p.m., Daniel finally called me directly. "You're destabilizing the company," he said. "No anger now, just calculation." "I'm stabilizing governance," I replied. "You think the board will let you remove me without consequence?" "I think the board prefers compliance over headlines." There was a long pause. "This won't end cleanly," he said. It already didn't. I answered. Resistance wasn't loud anymore, it was strategic, and the question was no longer whether I could remove him. It was whether the company could withstand the pressure before I did. When power feels cornered, does it retreat or double down? The boardroom was a vacuum. No air, no sound, just the hum of the HVAC system. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his posture an armor of feigned confidence. Vanessa was gone, escorted out an hour earlier after her badge was remotely deactivated. Now it was just Daniel, the board, and the reality he had tried to outrun. Board counsel, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, opened the session. "We are here to address the activation notice filed by Isabella Wren. As controlling shareholder of 90% of voting equity, her presence dictates the quorum. This is no longer a discussion." Daniel, it is a transition. Layer 1, the operational paralysis. The chief strategy officer, a man who had been Daniel's loyal shadow for 5 years, was the first to pivot. He didn't even look at Daniel as he spoke. "The $800 million acquisition is dead in the water," he said, his voice flat. "Target Council has invoked the key person clause. They refuse to sign with a CEO whose authority is under formal challenge. Operationally, we are frozen. We can't even buy a desk chair without Isabella's sign-off." Daniel's face reddened. "This is a temporary bottleneck caused by my daughter's—" "It's not a bottleneck, Daniel." Dalton, the oldest board member, interrupted. "It's a flat line, and we aren't going down with the ship." Layer 2, the fiduciary trap. Board counsel slid a tablet toward the center of the table. "Beyond the freeze," counsel said. "We've reviewed the board-approved termination memo issued to Isabella. We've checked the minutes for the last 6 months. There was no vote, no discussion, no restructuring." He paused, letting the silence grate on Daniel's nerves. "Daniel, you represented a personal whim as a board resolution. In the eyes of the law, that is material governance misrepresentation. If the investors find out you're running this company like a family kitchen, the class action lawsuits will be measured in the hundreds of millions. The board's D&O insurance won't cover a deliberate fraud." The shift was visible. The other board members, who had shared scotch with Daniel just weeks ago, were now leaning as far away from him as their chairs allowed. They weren't his friends anymore. They were potential defendants looking for a scapegoat. Layer 3, the ownership strike. I stood up. I didn't slam the table. I didn't need to. "I didn't activate the trust because I was fired," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. "I activated it because you, Daniel, forgot that you are an employee. You treated 90% of this company's soul as your personal inheritance. It isn't." I looked at the board. "I am the controlling shareholder. My motion is simple: the immediate removal of Daniel Cross for material breach of fiduciary duty and unauthorized exercise of executive power. You can't do this without a cooling-off period." Daniel barked, finally losing his cool. "Actually," Dalton said, his voice now cold and clinical, "under Section 4.2 of the Trust Proxy Alignment, the controlling shareholder's vote is immediate and final in cases of governance breach. I second the motion." "I concur," said another. "Agreed," followed the rest. A domino effect of self-preservation. Daniel looked around the table. He was looking for a hand to hold, a voice to defend him. He found nothing but expensive suits and averted eyes. "The motion carries," counsel announced. Daniel, you have 10 minutes to vacate the suite. Security is waiting. Daniel stood up, his chair screeching against the floor, the only loud thing left in his legacy. He looked at me, looking for Isabella, his daughter. I looked back at him as the chair of the board. Authority had not been stolen. It had simply returned to its rightful owner. Does inheriting control make you dominant or accountable for what you allow? Victory doesn't ring. It recalculates. By the next morning, headlines were already forming their own versions of the story. Founder's daughter ousts CEO in boardroom showdown. Family power. Struggle shakes $800 million acquisition. The market doesn't wait for nuance. Our stock opened down another 2.7% before stabilizing. Analysts requested clarification. Investors scheduled an emergency call. Governance correction looks identical to instability from the outside. Inside the building, the mood had shifted, but not into celebration. People moved carefully. Conversations lowered when I walked past. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. Marcus found me in the hallway outside the operations floor. I know you think this was necessary, he said quietly, but half the senior team feels blindsided. They don't know what comes next. I didn't do this for optics. I replied, I know, he said, but perception still matters. 2 days later, he submitted his resignation, officially to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, he didn't want to navigate the turbulence. That one hurt more than the headlines. On the investor call, I did not claim triumph. I acknowledged volatility. Yes, I said evenly. Leadership transitions create short-term instability, but unaddressed governance failures create long-term collapse. The acquisition partner requested renegotiation safeguards, not cancellation, but protection. Trust takes longer to rebuild than control does to assert. That evening, alone in my office, I looked at the empty chair across from my desk, the one Daniel used to occupy during late strategy sessions. Power had shifted, but it had not come without cost. Removing someone is decisive. Repairing what their removal shakes loose, that's leadership. When you correct the top, are you prepared to steady everything beneath it? I thought removing Daniel would stabilize the ground. It didn't. It exposed what had been quietly rotting underneath. 3 days after the board vote, our general counsel requested a closed-door session. There's something you need to see, she said. On the screen were archived executive approval logs, expense authorizations, consulting retainers, strategic advisory contracts approved under Vanessa's executive credentials. Most were inflated. Some were duplicated. One was tied to a shell consulting firm registered to a holding company linked to Daniel's private investments. Not illegal on its face, but dangerously close. If this becomes public, counsel said carefully, it won't be framed as a governance correction. It will be framed as internal corruption. Operational instability was one thing. Regulatory scrutiny was another. Then came the email. A major institutional investor holding nearly 12% minority stake formally requested an independent forensic audit before reaffirming their position. Translation: if they withdrew, our stock could drop another 15 to 20%. The $800 million acquisition partner sent a revised clause: leadership continuity must remain unchanged for 6 months, or the deal could be voided without penalty. 6 months. Under a company that had just removed its CEO, Daniel's legal counsel responded that afternoon with a threat of wrongful termination litigation, claiming board procedure, irregularities, and reputational damage. He wanted leverage. He wanted pressure. He wanted me to settle quietly. Instead, I authorized the independent audit. Full transparency, no internal containment. The boardroom felt colder during the announcement. You realize this puts everything under a microscope, Dalton warned. Yes, I replied. That's the point. If there were weaknesses left in our structure, I would rather they surface now than metastasize later. Power consolidation is easy. Institutional cleansing is not, because once you pull the thread at the top, you don't control how far it unravels. Are you willing to risk short-term collapse to ensure long-term integrity? The independent audit cleared the company. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. A handful of compliance lapses, weak oversight, poor documentation trails, nothing criminal, nothing fatal. The Shell Consulting contract was dissolved. The board formally adopted new conflict of interest provisions. Minority investors reaffirmed their positions conditionally, cautiously. The acquisition partner reactivated the deal. The stock recovered. Slowly, Daniel withdrew his legal threat once the audit findings were made public. Quietly, no press conference, no spectacle. And I did not pursue retaliation. I declined the CEO title when the board offered it permanently. I'll serve as chair. I said instead, oversight, not spotlight. Not. The company didn't need another dominant personality at the helm. It needed systems that worked even when personalities failed. On my office wall now hangs a framed certificate. Not the share transfer document, not the removal motion, but the updated governance charter signed by every board member, clear authority lines, independent audit protocols, separation of executive spouses from operational control, boundaries. That was always the real objective. Not revenge, not humiliation, just structure that could not be hijacked by proximity to power. My father once told me, ownership isn't control, it's responsibility. At 43, I finally understood what he meant. Power is loud when misused, but when it's earned, it becomes quiet, and quiet power builds things that last. Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support and subscribe for more stories like this and leave a comment with your perspective. We read everyone. The abnormal roar of a forklift engine and the screech of tires burning against the concrete floor tore through the warehouse's silence. I looked up just in time to see the machine fly past, missing a packing clerk by mere inches. Parcels shattered everywhere in a deafening crash. In the driver's seat was Kevin, Linda's brother, and the CEO's brother-in-law. He was wearing AirPods, clutching an open beer can, and his face flushed red as he laughed like he was playing a video game. Without a second thought, I lunged forward, killed the engine, and ripped the key from the ignition. "Kevin, what the hell are you doing?" I barked. "You aren't certified, and more importantly, you're intoxicated behind the wheel. Get down now before you cause an irreversible catastrophe." Kevin popped an earbud out and smirked at me with pure indifference. "Chill out, old man. Stop playing the hero. My brother-in-law owns this place. I can drive whatever I want. Give me the keys, unless you want me to call my sister in here." In the heat of the moment, the sharp click of high heels on the floor signaled Linda's arrival. Instead of screaming like a typical Karen, she approached with a terrifying calmness, her eyes dripping with disdain. She placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder and turned to me, her voice smooth but razor sharp. "Mark, why are you raising your voice at my brother in front of the other workers? We are a family here, and family is supposed to protect each other, not bully the vulnerable just to flex some pathetic little bit of power." I was stunned by her gaslighting. OSHA safety regulations aren't bullying. "Linda, Kevin almost caused a fatal accident." Linda smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Regulations are written by men. Mark, loyalty is not. You're disrupting our workflow and costing us money." Just then, Robert, the CEO, stepped down from the mezzanine office. Linda's demeanor shifted instantly. She clung to her husband's arm, playing the victim. "Robert, look, Mark is giving my brother a hard time again. He makes me feel like our family isn't even respected in your own company." Robert glared at me, completely ignoring the wreckage and the beer can in Kevin's hand. He delivered a line that made my blood boil. "Mark, I pay you to run this warehouse, not to educate my family. I don't care if you're technically right or wrong. I care about your attitude. My office. Now, and bring your badge. We need to discuss whether you truly belong in this family anymore. I'm Mark. If you saw me on the street, you'd see a quiet, middle-aged guy in a faded reflective vest, clutching a stack of technical inspection files. In Robert's eyes, I was just a high-level hire who happened to be there since day one. But there was one thing his arrogance blinded him to. I don't just run this warehouse. I am the system that keeps it from collapsing. With 15 years in the logistics industry, I possess something that money can't buy. In a hurry. A federal safety, U.S. DOT license registered in my personal name. For the past 5 years, Roberts Corporation has operated solely on my credentials and reputation. I'm the only one with deep-rooted connections to the owner-operators, the guys who trust my word. Not the empty promises of a CEO sitting in an air-conditioned office. I plan to stay here until retirement. But Linda and Kevin's arrival forced me to open the drawer containing the contingency plan I never wanted to touch. The heavy oak door of the conference room slammed shut, completely sealing off the chaos of the warehouse outside. Robert sat perched at the head of the table like a king preparing to pass a death sentence on a lowly servant. Beside him, Linda calmly sipped her tea. Her eyes locked on me with a triumphant gleam. Robert didn't waste time with a greeting. He slid a glossy polymer sheet across the table toward me. "Sign it, Mark. This is your one and only way out," Robert said coldly. I glanced at the header. Disciplinary agreement and admission of unprofessional conduct. And the content was a venomous career trap. It would force me to admit to harassing and threatening Linda and to acting with professional incompetence. Robert drummed his fingers on the table, his voice dripping with intimidation. My wife was terrified after what happened on the floor. "If you sign this and give Linda a public apology in front of the entire company tomorrow morning, I'll treat this as a temporary lapse in judgment due to work stress. Otherwise, I'm firing you immediately with a formal harassment charge. You know how small this industry is. Mark, once a harassment mark hits your federal record, no company from the East Coast to the West will touch you. Your career will go up in smoke in a heartbeat." I looked into Robert's eyes, trying to find a trace of the friend who used to pull all-nighters with me during the early days of the startup. But there was nothing left, only a man blinded by power and his wife's manipulation. Linda smirked, a bone-chillingly satisfied grin. "You see, Mark, we're a family here. But that's a reward reserved only for those who know how to obey." I didn't feel a shred of fear, and I didn't bother explaining the safety regulations they had willfully trampled on. I slowly pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers moving quickly across the screen to hit send on an email I'd had sitting in my drafts for a long time. The truth was, from the day Linda brought Kevin into the company, I smelled the rot. I had secretly hired my own lawyer to review my subcontracting agreements and found a loophole regarding the DOT safety license that Robert had carelessly signed off on years ago. I wasn't preparing to betray them. I was preparing to save myself for the moment Robert's family decided to make me their sacrificial lamb. As I pressed send, my hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but because I knew I was personally signing the death warrant for an empire I had spent my youth building. "I'm not signing a thing, Robert," I said, my voice so calm it even surprised me. "And you won't get the chance to fire me either, because I just submitted my resignation, effective immediately. But there's something you should know before I walk out that door." Robert raised an eyebrow, about to interrupt, but I pushed forward. In that email, I also officially notified the Department of Transportation, DOT, to trigger the owner fault termination clause, in case you've forgotten. Your entire 500 truck fleet is currently operating under a safety license in my personal name. As of this second, every single one of this corporation's trucks on the road is illegal and no longer covered by insurance. Good luck with the mess your family just created. I stood up, ripped the badge from my chest that I'd worn for half a decade, and tossed it into the trash can in the corner. Without a single look back, I walked out of the room, leaving behind Robert, his face pale as a ghost, and the sudden, frantic ringing of his phone. The calls from the legal department had already begun. I walked out of the corporate headquarters, breathing in the air of freedom for the first time in 5 years. But behind me, a financial storm was brewing, one that Robert lacked the skills to weather. His fatal mistake was viewing me as a replaceable cog, forgetting that I was the one holding the passport for his entire empire. In the United States, the trucking industry runs on federal trust. All 500 of the corporation's trucks were hitting the asphalt based on the safety US DOT license registered in my name. The moment my notification email to the Department of Transportation DOT was confirmed, Robert's entire fleet legally became ghosts, operating illegally on every highway in the country. Just 2 hours after my departure, Linda, with her blind overconfidence, appointed Kevin to take my place. Desperate to offset the chaos and prove the power of their nepotism, Kevin began ordering drivers to blow past their regulated hours, committing flagrant violations of ELD electronic logging device laws. He didn't realize that in this industry, cutting corners on driver rest periods is legal suicide. The first explosion hit at 4 p.m. One of our veteran drivers was pulled over by state troopers at a way station in Ohio. When the officers scanned the DOT code, the system flashed red safety license suspended. The truck was immediately impounded on the spot. But that wasn't even the worst part. When the insurance company received word of the incident, they conducted an emergency audit of the management records and discovered Kevin, a man with 0 professional certifications, running the show in my stead. The result was a total catastrophe. The insurance provider immediately canceled the policy, citing a violation of risk management provisions. Losing insurance meant Robert's empire was officially dead in the water. Industry giants like Amazon and Walmart use automated scanning systems that are incredibly strict. Within 30 minutes of the insurance cancellation, emergency contract termination notices began raining down on Robert's office like a monsoon. Billion-dollar contracts evaporated in a single afternoon. Word spread like wildfire through the trucking community, and the owner-operators who only ever worked there because they trusted me collectively shut off their engines and turned their rigs around. On the stock market, the corporation's share price entered a terminal freefall. Robert and Linda wanted to put family above everything else. And now, that very family was sinking together into the bottomless abyss of an unsalvageable bankruptcy. 3 days after I walked out, Robert's world collapsed faster than anyone could have imagined. But instead of a bankruptcy filing, I received a phone call in the middle of the night. Robert's voice was stripped of its usual arrogance. It was trembling, broken, and filled with utter despair. Mark, I'm so sorry. Linda and Kevin have ruined everything. The company is burning down and you're the only one who can put out the fire. For the sake of our friendship from the early days, please come to the office one last time. I'll sign whatever you want. Just please, save my life's work. I tossed and turned all night, even though they had humiliated me. I couldn't bear to watch the empire I'd spent 5 years building go up in smoke. The next morning, I walked into the corporate headquarters with the intention of lending Robert a hand to stabilize the situation before I truly moved on. But as I stepped into the lobby, there was no handshake of reconciliation. 2 police officers suddenly emerged from the shadows, blocking my path. Robert descended the stairs, his face devoid of the desperation he had shown the night before. Instead, he wore a venomous smirk and a gaze filled with murderous intent. Linda stood beside him, clutching a folder, looking as triumphant as a hunter who had just bagged their prey. "You're so naive, Mark," Robert laughed, his voice echoing through the lobby. "You really thought I'd just hand this company over to you? The police are here to arrest you for sabotaging our security systems and stealing trade secrets. I've already filed a lawsuit against you in federal court. You're going to rot in prison before you ever see that damn license of yours do you any good." Linda curled her lip in sheer contempt. "Thank you for walking straight into your own arrest. You really are just a stupid hired hand with cheap compassion." My heart sank, not out of fear, but out of pure disgust. It turned out my kindness was the very weapon they used to stab me in the back once again. I looked at Robert, the man I used to share cheap beers with when we first started out, now transformed into a monster completely corrupted by power. "You're right, Robert. I was naive to believe you had a shred of humanity left," I said. "I never imagined you could sink this low." The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists right in the middle of the lobby. Robert looked at me with the manic eyes of a man who thought he had just reclaimed his kingdom. He leaned in close to my ear, whispering in a voice dripping with triumph. "You lost. Mark, I'm going to use every connection I have to make sure you rot in prison. Thanks for the stupid kindness that brought you here to surrender." Linda stood by, nonchalantly taking photos on her phone as I was being led away. "Take him away, officer," she sneered. "People like this don't deserve a place in this society." I said nothing, keeping my head down as I walked. In that moment, I felt a genuine flicker of fear. Robert wasn't simple. He had prepared forged documents and bribed witnesses to frame me. If I couldn't trigger my plan inside that police station, but it would be game over at the interrogation room. Robert and his private attorney sat across from me. He confidently pushed a folder of evidence-forged logs, claiming I had wiped the system data toward the investigator. "I'd like to begin my statement," I said, calmly cutting Robert off as he rambled on about my alleged crimes. "And I have crucial evidence to surrender. It's on the USB drive in my front shirt pocket." And the officer took the drive and plugged it into the computer. Robert smirked. "What are you turning in souvenir photos?" But his grin froze as the screen flickered to life. It wasn't system data. It was the dashcam footage from the very forklift Kevin had been driving. "This is the newest line of forklifts the company just brought in," I explained to the investigator. "It features a 360-degree safety camera system that automatically records video and audio during collisions or improper operation. This data is uploaded directly to the manufacturer's cloud for insurance purposes. Robert has no power to delete it. Do you hear that? From the speakers, Kevin's shouting echoed clearly, followed by Linda barking orders at employees to cover for her brother. And then came the smoking gun, Robert's own voice. Just forge the safety reports. I'll sign off on them. Mark can't do a damn thing to us. The investigator frowned, looking at Robert with a completely different expression. Just then, my lawyer entered the room. But he wasn't alone. He handed the officer an emergency fax. Officer, I represent the creditors and 3 members of the board of directors. They aren't here in person, but they received a copy of this data via email the moment my client was illegally detained. They have held an emergency vote to terminate Robert for federal insurance fraud and endangering corporate assets. This is the official removal order. Robert collapsed into his chair, his hands trembling. It turned out I had configured the forklift manufacturer's system to send an alert with the evidence to the entire board if anyone attempted an unauthorized override to wipe the data. Robert thought he was trapping me, but in reality, he was confessing to the very people who held his fate in their hands. When the procedures at the station were finalized, the board representative looked at me with desperation. Mark, we know you've faced grave injustice, but the company is on the brink of collapse. If you don't step in, hundreds of drivers will lose their jobs tomorrow because there's no insurance and no license. We need you to come back not as an employee, but as the CEO. I stared out the window in silence. I had only wanted justice for myself, but the thought of those drivers, my brothers losing their livelihoods, was something I couldn't turn my back on. I nodded, but with one condition: Robert had to be cleared of his massive personal debts in exchange for transferring his shares to me. I didn't want to seize the company. I wanted to save a sinking ship. 2 hours later, I walked out of the station a free man. The next morning, I returned to the CEO's office. Robert and Linda were there, hollow-eyed, packing up their last luxury items. Linda glared at me with pure hatred, but Robert just kept his head down. You won, Mark. You took everything, Robert said bitterly. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steady. I didn't take anything from you, Robert. In fact, I just signed an agreement to take on the personal debt you secured using your mansion as collateral. Without this deal, your family wouldn't have a roof over their heads tonight. I didn't do this for you. I did it for the friendship we once had, and because I need this company stable to protect the jobs of the hundreds of employees out there. You broke this place just to please Linda. I'm the one trying to fix it. As security escorted them out of the building, I didn't sit in the CEO chair to enjoy the victory. I picked up the dispatch radio, took a deep breath, and broadcasted to the entire company. Attention everyone, and this is Mark. I'm back. The safety license has been restored, and the insurance is active. You are cleared to start your engines. From this day forward, we aren't a toxic nepotism shop anymore. We are a professional team that respects one another. Welcome back. After my final announcement echoed through the radio system, a heavy silence hung over the warehouse for a few seconds. Then, suddenly, it erupted with the cheers of the drivers. I looked down at the yard from the CEO's office, watching the massive trucks begin to puff white smoke, gearing up for the safe journeys ahead. Robert and Linda were gone. I heard that they later had to sell off their remaining assets just to cover the DOT fines and legal fees. As for Kevin, he was permanently stripped of his right to operate heavy machinery. I didn't feel a surge of joy at their failure, but I did feel a profound sense of relief that justice had finally been served. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my old name badge, the one I had tossed into the trash just days before. I didn't pin it back on my chest. Instead, I placed it prominently on the desk as a constant reminder. Real power doesn't come from a title or a bloodline. It comes from respect, ethics, and the value we create for others. The old chapter closed with betrayal and tears, but a new one had begun, and this time, it would be built on integrity. I'm Mark, and this is how I reclaimed what was mine. What happens when loyalty is replaced in front of witnesses? My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent 11 of those years building the enterprise division of Hayes Strategic Group from a fragile revenue stream into a $500 million annual recurring revenue enterprise portfolio. I didn't inherit the accounts. I rebuilt them contract by contract, renewal by renewal, crisis by crisis. The restaurant glowed with soft amber lighting, private room reserved, champagne already poured. Monica Hayes, our CEO, had insisted on calling it a leadership celebration. Everyone assumed the announcement would formalize what had been hinted at for months, my promotion to Senior Vice President of Enterprise Strategy. I stood when she tapped her glass. "Tonight," Monica began, smiling broadly, "we recognize bold leadership, fresh vision, decisive action." My pulse stayed steady. I'd learned long ago not to react before the sentence ended. "Effective immediately." She continued, "Daniel Hayes will assume oversight of all enterprise accounts." Applause broke out, confused at first, then enthusiastic, once people registered the name. Her husband, 3 months in the company. Daniel rose from his seat at the end of the table. Adjusting his cufflinks like this had always been inevitable. "Daniel brings a perspective we need at this level," Monica said lightly. "It's time for a different kind of leadership." A few awkward laughs followed. Someone clapped harder to fill the silence. Then came the operational shift. "Enterprise relationships will be reassigned starting Monday," Monica said. "Full transition under executive authority. No transition plan. No client notice. No compliance review. Just declaration." Daniel gave me a polite nod as if I'd been part of the arrangement. I lifted my glass. "To new leadership," I said evenly. "If humiliation is meant to provoke collapse, composure is its quiet refusal." No one noticed the difference between applause and absence. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. Most executives skim contracts. I write them. 3 years ago, after a failed acquisition nearly cost us our largest client, I insisted on restructuring our enterprise agreements. Not the pricing, not the performance metrics, continuity. Each of the 3 flagship contracts, collectively representing just over $500 million in recurring revenue, contained a provision titled Continuity Leadership Clause. It was simple in wording, ruthless in effect. Each account would designate a sole relationship executive. Any reassignment required, written client notification, 30-day transition certification, executive continuity acknowledgement signed by both parties. Failure to complete those steps would automatically trigger a 30-day review window, renewal suspension rights, full service performance audit. Eligibility, the clause was not about ego. It was about trust. 2 of them had lived through vendor turnover that cost them outages, and they wrote the safeguard into negotiations themselves. Enterprise clients don't buy logos. They buy stability. They buy predictability. They buy the assurance that the person who understands their infrastructure won't disappear because someone at the top wants to make a statement. For 11 years, my name sat on all 3 contracts. Sole relationship executive Eleanor Vance. Monica had signed those agreements personally, and she never objected to the clause. In fact, at the time, she praised it. "Smart safeguard," she'd said, "shows maturity." But Monica rarely read past summaries. She delegated detail to legal. She believed authority solved complexity. Daniel certainly hadn't read them. 3 months into the company, he was still asking basic questions about revenue cycles and escalation matrices. Contracts were abstractions to him, thick documents stored somewhere in legal's archive. The continuity leadership clause applied to resignation, but it also applied to reassignment. That distinction mattered, because when Monica publicly transferred $500 million worth of enterprise oversight to her husband without notice, without documentation, without certification, she didn't just change reporting lines. She initiated exposure. The clause doesn't activate when someone leaves emotionally. It activates when authority bypasses procedure. And the difference between the two is everything. If stability is written into a contract, what happens when leadership ignores the writing? I didn't resign that night. I waited. Emotion makes noise. Documentation builds leverage. At 6:12 a.m., Monday morning, the company-wide email arrived. Subject: Enterprise Leadership Realignment. Effective immediately, Daniel Hayes will assume oversight of all enterprise accounts under executive authority. We are confident this transition reflects our commitment to modernization and stronger strategic vision. No mention of transition certification. No client acknowledgement. No continuity documentation attached. Just declaration. I downloaded the email. Then I opened the archive contracts. Clause 9.4, continuity leadership. The language was clear. Reassignment required written client notice and 30-day certification prior to authority transfer. Not optional, not symbolic, required. At 8:03 a.m., Daniel forwarded a message to the enterprise clients. Looking forward to strengthening our partnership moving forward. No reference to transition protocol. No acknowledgement of reassignment documentation. That was the moment it shifted from insult to exposure. I began building a clean timeline. Friday, public reassignment announcement. Monday, 6:12 a.m., internal realignment email. Monday, 8:03 a.m., client-facing communication. No certification filed. No legal review logged. I logged into the governance portal. No board vote authorizing structural reassignment. No compliance memo. No continuity acknowledgement. This wasn't just premature, it was procedurally incomplete. At 9:27 a.m., I submitted my resignation to HR. Effective immediately. Not dramatic, not accusatory, professional. If I stayed, they could claim I approved the transition by participation. So I resigned cleanly so the record would show they acted alone. Because the clause didn't care about my feelings, it cared about designation. And once my name was removed without certification, the 30-day review window became eligible for invocation by any client who chose to read carefully. Most executives assume clients don't, but enterprise legal teams always do. When authority moves faster than compliance, who notices first, the company or the client? Monday didn't explode. It proceeded. At 9 a.m., Daniel Hayes logged into the enterprise dashboard for the first time with full administrative privileges, provisioned through an emergency access request approved in minutes. The system reflected the reassignment immediately. His name now appeared under all 3 flagship accounts. No transition certification had been filed. No 30-day continuity notice had been sent. No client acknowledgement had been logged. But the org chart had changed. And in most companies, that is mistaken for legitimacy. At 10:14 a.m., the first enterprise client responded to Daniel's introduction email. Please confirm formal continuity documentation under Section 9.4. Polite, precise. Daniel forwarded the message to legal. Can someone handle this, he wrote. Legal requested the transition package. There wasn't one. By noon, 2 additional clients had asked similar questions. Not accusatory, not hostile, just careful. Enterprise clients are accustomed to volatility in markets. They are not accustomed to volatility in representation. At 1:32 p.m., compliance flagged the absence of a reassignment filing in the governance portal. Automatic reminder sent. No response logged. The problem wasn't that Daniel lacked confidence. He had plenty of that. The problem was that authority had moved faster than documentation. In the boardroom, Monica reassured the senior team. It's just procedural noise, she said. Clients always ask questions. But questions, when written into contracts, are not noise. They are triggers. Because under the continuity leadership clause, reassignment without certification does not invalidate authority immediately. It makes it reviewable, and reviewable authority is fragile. By the end of the day, nothing had collapsed. No contracts terminated, no headlines printed. But 3 legal departments were reading the same clause. And when enterprise legal teams read in parallel, events rarely remain internal for long. When power skips procedure, who decides whether it still counts? If Monica had paused, the clause might have remained dormant. She didn't. At 8:47 a.m., Tuesday morning, an executive-level email was sent directly to the legal and procurement contacts of all 3 enterprise clients. Subject, formal confirmation of enterprise leadership transition. Effective immediately, Daniel Hayes is the authorized executive overseeing your account. All future strategic communication and approvals should be directed to him. No attachment, no transition certification, no continuity acknowledgement, no 30-day notice reference, just assertion. The language mattered. It wasn't exploratory. It wasn't introductory. It was declarative. At 9:16 a.m., the first response arrived. Per Section 9.4, Continuity Leadership, please provide documentation confirming reassignment protocol compliance. At 9:22 a.m., a second client replied with identical phrasing. Legal departments don't improvise. They quote, by 9:31 a.m., internal compliance flagged the issue as contractual review eligible. That was the line. Under the clause, reassignment without certification triggered a 30-day review window at the client's discretion. At 9:47 a.m., Client 1 formally invoked it. Pending verification of continuity compliance, we are initiating a 30-day performance and governance review as permitted under Section 9.4. The email was copied to Hayes Strategic Legal Board Oversight Liaison CFO Office at 10:02 a.m. Client 2 followed at 10:11 a.m. Client 3 requested a temporary renewal freeze pending review outcome. 3 contracts, $500 million in recurring revenue exposure. Not terminated. Paused. At 10:18 a.m., CFO Michael Trent called Monica directly. What documentation did we send before the reassignment, he asked. Silence. Then, we'll manage it. But revenue doesn't respond to optimism. By noon, finance had flagged a potential 18% earnings vulnerability if even one renewal shifted under review. Investor chatter hit fast. By close, the company was down small but noticeable. No scandal, no press release, just measurable risk. The clause had not been activated by resignation. It had been activated by representation. And when authority is declared without compliance, contracts don't argue, they respond. What happens when confidence signs an email? A contract refuses to recognize confidence performs well in meetings. Metrics perform everywhere else. By Wednesday morning, Daniel's calendar was full. 3 enterprise accounts under 30-day review meant 3 parallel audit streams. Service tickets were reclassified as priority visibility. Escalations that once passed quietly through my direct line now surfaced in shared dashboards. At 9:05 a.m., Client 1 requested a full performance summary for the previous 2 quarters' response times. Resolution metrics, executive escalation records. At 9:22 a.m., Client 2 asked for written confirmation of who held final strategic approval authority during the review window. Daniel forwarded both requests to operations. Pull whatever Eleanor used to send, he wrote. There wasn't a template. There was history. And history lives in relationships, not folders. By noon, response time thresholds began slipping. One escalation missed the executive response window. Another slipped past SLA under review. Minor on paper, significant under review. Compliance flagged the deviation. At 1:47 p.m., Finance circulated an internal update. Preliminary forecast adjustment required if review window extends beyond 30 days. Potential exposure, $87 million in deferred renewal timing. Deferred doesn't mean lost, it means uncertain. Uncertainty is what markets punish. By 3:10 p.m., the investor relations team had drafted contingency language for the upcoming earnings call carefully worded. Non-alarmist, but undeniably cautious. Temporary client governance reviews impacting renewal scheduling. That phrase alone erased the illusion of control. In the executive suite, Monica insisted stability would return once clients adjusted to the new leadership, but adjustment requires reassurance, and reassurance requires documentation. Daniel held meetings back-to-back, voice steady, posture confident. Yet every time a client referenced Section 9.4, the conversation narrowed. Authority no longer came from title. It came from proof. By Thursday, internal dashboards showed a visible dip in client satisfaction scores, 2 percentage points. Not catastrophic, but measurable. And measurable shifts accumulate, because when review windows open, performance stops being assumed. It is examined. When metrics replace confidence, which one survives the scrutiny? The emergency board session was scheduled for Friday at 8 a.m. No press, no executive assistants, just directors, legal counsel, the CFO, and Monica. At the head of the table, Daniel sat to her right. $500 million in enterprise renewals sat in the margins of the printed board packet. CFO Michael Trent opened the meeting. 3 enterprise clients have formally invoked 30-day governance review under Section 9.4. Renewal scheduling is paused pending compliance verification. He projected the performance dashboard onto the screen. Layer 1, operational instability. 2 SLA breaches during review window. 4 escalations reclassified as high risk. Client satisfaction, dip of 2.1%. Executive authority documentation incomplete. These are manageable deviations, Daniel said evenly. Short-term friction. Under review conditions, Michael replied. Short-term friction is magnified. Silence settled. Layer 2, financial exposure. A second slide appeared. If one client delays renewal beyond Q4, Michael continued, we face an $87 million revenue timing gap. If 2 delay, exposure exceeds $170 million. If review findings escalate into structural renegotiation, maximum exposure reaches $500 million across the portfolio. not lost revenue. Exposed revenue, but exposure shifts leverage. Why was continuity documentation not filed before reassignment board member Kaplan asked? Monica answered, "It was an internal leadership decision. We believed documentation could follow. Contracts don't operate on belief." Kaplan replied. Layer 3, reputation reversal. General counsel spoke next. All 3 clients have requested written confirmation of whether the board authorized the reassignment. The question lingered, because the board had not. No vote. No recorded resolution, just executive action. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. We acted within executive authority. You acted, Kaplan corrected, without procedural compliance. And that distinction was now written into 3 legal correspondence threads shared with their procurement departments. If clients determined governance instability, renewal leverage would invert. The board did not raise their voices. They recalculated. By 9:12 a.m., a motion was introduced, immediate suspension of Daniel's direct oversight pending review, mandatory compliance certification, submission within 72 hours, independent audit of executive reassignment procedures. The motion passed. It wasn't about punishment, it was containment, not unanimously, but decisively. Authority had not collapsed dramatically. It had narrowed. Monica remained CEO. Daniel retained his title, but operational oversight returned temporarily to interim committee control. And for the first time that week, the room felt smaller. Because titles survive embarrassment, they rarely survive documented exposure. When leadership bypasses structure, who ultimately governs the executive or the contract? Stability returned slowly, never dramatically. By Monday, compliance had submitted retroactive continuity documentation to all 3 enterprise clients. Transition certification was formally drafted. The board's interim oversight committee assumed temporary supervision of the accounts. Technically, the damage had been contained. Practically, the cost had already been recorded. The stock recovered half of its drop, but not all. Analysts adjusted their outlook from stable growth to cautious hold. Investor calls shifted tone. Questions about governance now appeared alongside performance metrics. Reputation doesn't crash, it thins. Internally, the company moved with careful precision. Every executive decision now required documentation routing. Legal was looped into conversations that once happened over coffee. Monica did not speak publicly about the incident. She didn't need to. The board memo circulated quietly through senior leadership. Future reassignment of designated enterprise executives requires pre-clearance certification. The clause that had once been overlooked was now highlighted in policy updates. Correction had come, but correction extracts cost from everyone involved. For me, it was simpler and more personal. I had forfeited unvested equity the moment I resigned 2 years' worth. Voluntary resignation meant no severance, just silence and receipts. I stepped into a 90-day income gap before my new role formally began. Recruiters called cautiously, probing whether I had destabilized leadership. Integrity is rarely convenient. It is expensive. 3 enterprise clients requested direct confirmation that I was no longer affiliated with Hayes Strategic Group. Not accusatory, just procedural. Trust had to be re-anchored. By Friday, Daniel's authority remained limited, not revoked, restricted. The board would not make another impulsive decision so soon. No one celebrated, because this had never been a dramatic overthrow. It was a structural correction. And structural corrections don't produce applause, they produce caution. When you fix a fracture at the top, are you prepared for the quiet cost beneath it? The board's intervention didn't end the pressure, it redistributed it. On Tuesday morning, I received a formal letter from Hayes Strategic's outside counsel, subject Notice of Potential Non-Compete. Enforcement. The language was restrained but unmistakable. It referenced my executive access to enterprise strategy, proprietary escalation frameworks, renewal timelines. It suggested that if any Hayes client transitioned to my new firm within 12 months, litigation would follow. Not accusation, preemptive positioning. By noon, 2 enterprise contacts had already requested exploratory meetings with Carter and Vail Consulting Andrews' firm, where I had accepted a managing director role. I hadn't solicited them. They reached out. That distinction matters especially when lawyers start circling. It matters even more in optics. Andrew called me directly. If this becomes a legal fight, he said, we're prepared. Prepared meant discovery. Discovery meant internal correspondence. Internal correspondence meant board transcripts referencing governance missteps. Monica understood that too. At 2:15 p.m., her office sent a second communication, less formal, more personal. Let's resolve this without escalation. Pressure was no longer operational. It was reputational. If Hayes pursued litigation and lost Banmusads, they would expose procedural negligence in public filings. If they didn't pursue it, they risked appearing weak. Either path carried cost. Meanwhile, an institutional investor requested confirmation that executive disputes would not impact client retention forecasts. Markets sense instability faster than they analyze it. By Thursday, 3 enterprise clients formally confirmed they were evaluating competitive proposals as part of standard review. Standard, but timed. I reviewed every communication I had sent since resigning. Every email was documented, every conversation archived, clean. Not because I anticipated conflict, because documentation is habit. Andrew asked the question plainly. If they push, do you counterclaim I could? Governance misrepresentation, procedural negligence, retaliatory threat. The leverage existed, but destruction is rarely strategic. On Friday afternoon, Hayes Strategics Counsel withdrew the enforcement notice. No admission, no apology, just quiet retreat. Pressure had come from legal, from investors, from optics. It had not broken me. It had revealed the limits of their own exposure. If you have the power to escalate publicly, is restraint weakness or strategy? The acquisition never collapsed. It recalibrated. 30 days after the review window opened, all 3 enterprise clients formally closed their governance audits. No breach findings, no termination. Just amended continuity language and reinforced documentation protocols. Hayes, Strategic survived, but it did not emerge unchanged. Daniel's executive authority over enterprise accounts was permanently removed. The board restructured reporting lines to require dual signature certification for any future reassignment of designated relationship executives. A new governance amendment was adopted. No related party may hold operational authority without independent board review. It wasn't written because of me. It was written because of exposure. Monica remained CEO, publicly composed, privately constrained. Authority that once moved unchallenged now required documentation trails and board oversight. Correction had become policy. As for me, I began my first official quarter at Carter & Vale Consulting with 3 exploratory enterprise partnerships, not transfers, not poaching, just clients exercising choice. My 90-day income gap ended. My unvested equity remained forfeited. 2 former colleagues never spoke to me again. One quietly reached out months later to say, "You were right. I wasn't trying to be right. I was trying to be respected. There is a difference." Monica sent one final message, brief and carefully neutral. "We wish you continued success." No acknowledgement of the promotion party. No acknowledgement of the email that triggered $500 million in review exposure. Just closure. But closure is not reversal. Respect offered after leverage shifts is not respect. It is correction. And correction is not retroactive. The framed document in my new office isn't a contract. It's a simple printed line from the amended governance charter. Continuity is not optional because loyalty without procedure is vulnerability, and authority without structure eventually answers to both. Respect is not retroactive. It is demonstrated or it costs. Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read everyone